On the morning of March 14, 2017, a real estate attorney named Gerald Finch drove a white Ford Expedition down County Road 12 outside Harlan, Iowa, and parked in front of a two-story white farmhouse that had stood on the same 640 acres since 1949. He stepped out, adjusted his tie against a wind that smelled of thawed mud and diesel, and knocked on the door. No one answered. He knocked again. After a long pause, the door opened, and a man named Dale Cutler, 61 years old, stood in the frame wearing jeans, a flannel shirt, and the particular expression of someone who already knows what is about to be said. Gerald Finch held out an envelope. Inside was a final notice from First Midwest AG Credit. Dale Cutler's farm, all 640 acres, the equipment shed, the grain bins, the hog finishing barn, and the house where his father was born, was being sold at a sheriff's auction in 42 days. The total debt outstanding was $2.3 million. The expected sale price, according to county assessors, was $2.1 million. Dale Cutler was going to lose everything, and he was also going to come out the other side still owing $200,000. He took the envelope. He said thank you. He closed the door. That moment, quiet, unremarkable, witnessed only by Gerald Finch and the Iowa wind, was the beginning of a story that, 5 years later, would be discussed at land-grant universities, quoted in agricultural policy hearings, and quietly referenced by a growing number of farmers across the upper Midwest who were trying to understand how a man who everyone agreed was wrong turned out to be the only person who was right. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Dale Cutler was, and you have to understand the world he was operating in, because both of those things matter enormously. Dale was born in 1956 in Shelby County, Iowa. His father, Harold Cutler, had bought the farm in 1949 for $38,000, an enormous sum at the time, financed through a local savings institution that is now long gone. Harold was a corn and soybean man, careful and deliberate, a farmer in the old sense, meaning he observed things, kept records and paper ledgers, and believed that the land had a kind of memory that rewarded patience and punished greed. Dale grew up working alongside his father, and he absorbed that philosophy the way children absorb language, without effort, without awareness, and so completely that it became indistinguishable from his own thinking. He took over the farm in 1989 when Harold had a stroke. He was 33 years old. He had a wife named Karen, a daughter named Melissa who was 8, and a son named Ryan who was 5. He had inherited the farm along with its debts, its equipment, and its rhythms. He had also inherited Harold's ledgers, which he kept and continued adding to, year by year, in the same style of composition notebook his father had used. For most of the 1990s, Dale did reasonably well. Corn prices were acceptable, soybeans were steady, and while the farm never made him wealthy, it supported his family and allowed him to keep the land improving, rotating crops, letting cover crops rebuild nitrogen, managing drainage tiles with the attention of a man who understood that water is the variable that ruins or saves everything in Iowa. He drove a used pickup. He took his family to the Iowa State Fair every August. He paid his bills, usually on time. But the agricultural world around Dale was changing in ways that were not immediately visible from the seat of a tractor. Throughout the 1990s and accelerating sharply after 2000, the structure of American agriculture was consolidating at a rate that had no historical precedent. In 1980, the top 4 beef processing companies controlled about 36% of the market. By 2010, they controlled more than 80%. In grain, the pattern was similar. For companies Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus, known collectively in the trade as the ABCD companies, had come to dominate the global movement of corn and soybeans so completely that they effectively set the terms under which American farmers operated. Local grain elevators, which had once been independent and competitive, were increasingly owned by or contracted to these large entities. The price a farmer received at the elevator was no longer a local negotiation, it was a number determined by forces operating in Chicago, Geneva, and Sao Paulo. At the same time, the equipment required to farm competitively was becoming dramatically more expensive. A new John Deere 8 Series tractor in 2010 cost between $200,000 and $280,000. A modern combine with the right head attachment could run $400,000 or more. Precision agriculture technology, GPS guidance, yield monitors, variable rate application systems added tens of thousands of dollars more. The logic being sold to farmers was compelling on its surface: larger equipment, more acres, lower cost per bushel. Scale. Efficiency. The farms that would survive were the farms that could operate at industrial volumes. Dale Cutler did not want to operate at industrial volumes. This was not stubbornness, or not only stubbornness. It was a considered position, rooted in observation. He had watched the farmers around him take on debt to buy more land and bigger equipment, and he had noticed something that the balance sheets didn't immediately reveal: the more acres they farmed, the thinner their margins became on each individual acre, and the more vulnerable they were to any single bad year. The math worked only if prices stayed high and inputs stayed manageable. Neither of those things was guaranteed. In 2012, Dale made a decision that most people in his county considered either brave or foolish, depending on who you asked. He refused to sign a production contract with a regional processor that was offering to lock in prices for his soybeans over a 3-year period. The contract terms looked favorable on paper: a guaranteed minimum price, input cost sharing, preferred elevator access. But Dale had read the fine print, and the fine print gave the processor the right to set quality standards after harvest, a clause that could effectively allow them to reject or downgrade his crop for reasons he couldn't entirely control. He walked away from the deal. His neighbor, a man named Tom Beecham who farmed 1,800 acres 2 miles north, signed the contract and told Dale plainly that he was making a mistake. Karen thought Dale was making a mistake too. She didn't say it in those words. Karen was not a confrontational woman, but she asked questions at the kitchen table that made her concern clear. What was their plan if prices dropped? What would they do when the 2014 note on the equipment came due? Ryan, who was by then working on the farm alongside his father, tended to agree with his mother. Ryan had taken some agricultural business classes at Iowa State, and he spoke in the language of that education: cash flow projections, debt service ratios, operating margins. He was not wrong to think in those terms. But he and his father could not quite reach each other across the gap of their different frameworks. The period between 2012 and 2015 was, in retrospect, a trap that many Midwest farmers fell into without understanding what was happening. Corn prices, which had spiked to historic highs near $8 per bushel in 2012, driven partly by drought and partly by ethanol demand, began a long and grinding decline. By late 2014, corn was trading at $3.20 per bushel. Soybean prices, which had been holding near $14 per bushel, fell toward $9. Land values, which had been inflated by years of high commodity prices, began to soften. Farmers who had bought land at peak prices using variable rate operating loans found themselves in a position where the collateral supporting their debt was worth less than it had been when they borrowed against it. Dale's situation was not caused by any single catastrophe. It was the accumulation of several years of below-average prices: a wet spring in 2015 that delayed planting by nearly 3 weeks and reduced his corn yield by roughly 18%, a drain tile failure in his east field that took $40,000 to repair, and the refinancing of his primary land loan in 2016 at terms that, while not predatory, were unfavorable given the income the farm was then producing. By early 2017, his debt-to-asset ratio had climbed to a point where First Midwest AG Credit, after an internal portfolio review, flagged his account and began the process that ended with Gerald Finch on his doorstep with an envelope. The auction was scheduled for April 25, 2017. It was listed in the Harlan Tribune and on the county sheriff's website, as required by law. The bidders who showed up included 3 land investment funds, 2 neighboring farmers looking to expand their operations, and a company called Meridian Agricultural Holdings, which had been quietly acquiring distressed farmland across 4 Midwestern states for approximately 2 years. Meridian's representative, a young man in a navy blazer who drove a rental car and carried a tablet instead of paper, bid efficiently and without emotion. Meridian acquired the 640 acres for $2.08 million. After the bank was paid, Dale Cutler received a check for approximately $60,000, essentially nothing, relative to a lifetime of work, and was given 60 days to vacate the property. Karen's sister lived in Ames. They moved into her spare bedroom while they figured out what came next. And here is where most people, if they were writing this story, would end it. The farmer loses the farm. The corporation wins. The community diminishes. The story of American agriculture in miniature, repeated 10,000 times across the Midwest in any given decade. But Dale Cutler did not end the story there. And the reason he didn't, the reason what came next was possible, has everything to do with those composition notebooks. Harold Cutler had started keeping records in 1949. He noted weather, yields, input costs, soil observations, which fields responded to which treatments, or water pooled after heavy rain, which fence rows seemed to affect wind erosion and which didn't. Dale had continued the practice without interruption from 1989 onward. By 2017, he had 28 years of his own data, plus Harold's records going back 38 years before that. 66 years of continuous, detailed, first-person observation of 640 specific acres in Shelby County, Iowa. No agronomist had that data. No land investment company had it. Meridian Agricultural Holdings certainly didn't. In the months after the auction, while living in Ames and taking occasional work driving a grain truck for a local co-op, Dale did something that surprised even Karen. He started writing. Not journaling, exactly, something more organized. He went through the notebooks systematically, looking for patterns he had always felt intuitively but never articulated. He was particularly focused on water. He knew his east field retained moisture differently than his neighbor's land. He knew his north field, which looked flat to any observer, had a subtle east-west grade that made it drain faster than it appeared to. He knew where the tile lines ran, where they had failed historically, where the soil profile shifted from heavy clay to the lighter, darker loam that held nutrients better and required different fertility management. He also started reading more carefully than he had before, not the agricultural trade press, which he found increasingly written for the interests of input companies and large-scale operators, but academic work. Soil science journals. Research from the Rodale Institute. Work coming out of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, on perennial grain crops and prairie-based agriculture. A paper published in 2015 in the journal Nature Plants about the relationship between soil microbial diversity and long-term yield stability that read, to Dale, like a scientific confirmation of things his father had been saying in practical terms decades earlier. In the fall of 2017, he wrote a letter to an agricultural extension specialist at Iowa State named Dr. Patricia Welch, who had published research on precision soil management. He explained who he was, what he had lost, and what he had observed over decades of farming the same ground. He didn't ask for money or sympathy. He asked if his data was worth anything to her research. She wrote back in 10 days. She said she would like to see the notebooks. What happened over the following 18 months was the result of a collaboration between an academic who had been searching for long-term observational data and a farmer who had it in abundance. Dr. Welch and 2 graduate students drove to Ames, sat with Dale over 2 weekends, and went through the notebooks systematically. They photographed every page. They entered the data into spreadsheets, cross-referenced it with USDA yield records and county weather data, and began to see something that Dale had only partially understood himself. His north field, 160 acres, had consistently outperformed county averages for corn yield by approximately 11% over a 30-year period, even in drought years. This was not obvious from looking at the field. It looked like any other Iowa cornfield. But the combination of Dale's soil management practices, his cover cropping rotations, and a particular soil amendment program he had been running since 1998, adding a specific combination of composted material from his hog operation to a specific zone of the field each fall, had produced a soil health profile that was, according to Dr. Welch's analysis, measurably superior to surrounding land. The organic matter content in that zone was 4.8%, against a county average of 2.9%. That difference translated, in practical terms, to significantly better water retention during dry periods and better drainage during wet periods, the 2 variables that matter most in Iowa agriculture. More importantly, that soil profile made the land significantly less reliant on synthetic nitrogen inputs than comparable fields. Dale had been applying roughly 140 pounds of nitrogen per acre on that field. County averages for comparable corn production were running 160 to 180 pounds per acre. His yields were better, his input costs were lower, and he hadn't fully understood why, because he had simply been doing what felt right based on observation, not what was recommended by the extension guides or the agronomists working for the seed and fertilizer companies. Dr. Welch published a paper in early 2019 in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation. It was not a dramatic publication, academic papers rarely are, but it was specific, it was well documented, and it said plainly that the soil management practices employed on the Cutler Farms North Field over a 30-year period had produced measurable, replicable improvements in soil health that corresponded with reduced input costs and above-average yield stability. The paper cited Dale Cutler by name. It described his methodology. It provided data. The paper was read, among others, by a man named James Okafor, who ran a small but growing food company based in Minneapolis called Prairie Source Foods. Prairie Source was in the business of sourcing grain for a product line that emphasized what the marketing called regenerative agriculture, a term that had, by 2019, moved from fringe environmental conversations into mainstream consumer awareness with surprising speed. Prairie Source needed suppliers who could document their soil practices. Most farmers couldn't. The certification processes were expensive, time-consuming, and required exactly the kind of long-term observational records that almost no individual farmer maintained. Dale Cutler had 66 years of them. James Okafor called Dale in March 2019. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Okafor explained what Prairie Source was trying to do and what they needed. Dale explained what he had. By the end of the conversation, Okafor had proposed something that neither of them had fully anticipated at the start. Rather than simply contracting with Dale to grow grain, Prairie Source was interested in helping him reacquire farmland, specifically land with the soil characteristics his records documented, and operated under a supply agreement that would pay a significant premium over commodity prices in exchange for verified regenerative practices and the documentation that made verification credible. The premium Okafor was offering was $2.10 per bushel above the Chicago Board of Trade price for corn and $3.40 per bushel above commodity for soybeans. On a 160-acre field yielding 185 bushels per acre of corn, that premium alone represented an additional $61,000 per year in revenue compared to selling at commodity prices. The economics were not miraculous, the operating costs were real. The land acquisition cost was real, but they were fundamentally different from the economics Dale had been trying to survive on before. In the fall of 2019, Dale Cutler and Karen Cutler, along with a small operating loan backed by Prairie Source's supply commitment, purchased 200 acres in Shelby County, not his original farm, which Meridian was still operating conventionally, but adjacent ground with similar soil characteristics that Dale had known since childhood. He paid $6,200 per acre, a total of $1.24 million. The loan terms were manageable given the contracted revenue. He was farming again. He was 53 years old and starting over, and it was, by every measure, a better start than the one he had lost. By 2021, Dale had his first full crop year under the Prairie Source contract. His corn yield was 191 bushels per acre on the main field, below the county's record but above its average, and achieved with nitrogen application rates approximately 25% lower than conventional practice. His total revenue for the year, including the premium, was $412,000. His total operating costs, including land payment, inputs, equipment lease, and overhead, were $287,000. His net before taxes was $125,000, not wealth, but a living, and a sustainable one, and one that was not dependent on the price of corn staying above any particular number because the premium contract provided a buffer that commodity farmers simply did not have. The Meridian field next door, his original 640 acres, now farmed by contract operators using large-scale conventional methods, yielded 198 bushels per acre that year. But Meridian's operators were selling at commodity prices, which averaged $5.40 per bushel for corn in 2021. Dale was selling at $7.50. Meridian soil organic matter on the old Cutler ground, according to county extension testing done as part of a separate research project, had declined measurably in 4 years of conventional tillage. The invisible advantage Dale had spent decades building was being spent down by people who didn't know it was there. In 2022, Dale was invited to speak at an agricultural conference in Des Moines. He was uncomfortable with this. He was not a speaker. He brought his notebooks, the originals, Harold's, and his own, and he set them on the table in front of him and talked for 40 minutes about what was in them. He talked about what his father had understood and what he had tried to continue. He talked about the sheriff's auction, about Gerald Finch and the envelope, about living in his sister-in-law's spare bedroom. He talked about Dr. Welch and James Okafor and the odd sequence of events that had followed from a letter written on a quiet afternoon when he had nothing left to lose. There were 340 people in the room. When he finished, the applause was long and, from several observers who attended, somewhat stunned, the reaction of people who have been handed a mirror and are not entirely comfortable with what they see in it. The longer-term effects of what Dale Cutler had demonstrated were not immediate or dramatic. They operated the way soil health operates, slowly, incrementally, in ways that are difficult to measure in any given season but unmistakable over time. By 2023, PrairieSource had expanded its supplier network to 47 farms across Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois. 11 of those farmers had been connected to the company through a farmer-to-farmer network that Dale had helped organize informally, people who had heard him speak or read about his story and called him directly. He spent time with each of them going through their records, such as they were, and helping them articulate what they knew. Not all of them had data as detailed as his. But all of them knew things about their land that no outside investor or corporate agronomist knew, and that knowledge had value, and the market for that value was growing. The regenerative agriculture premium market, which had been estimated at roughly $900 million in 2018, was projected by independent agricultural economists to exceed $15 billion by 2030. That growth was being driven not by idealism but by consumer demand, corporate sustainability commitments, and a growing body of evidence that soil health practices reduced input costs in ways that eventually showed up in margins even without premium pricing. The direction of the economics was not in question. Only the timing was. In late 2023, a policy researcher at the Environmental Defense Fund published a brief that analyzed the Cutler case and 4 similar cases as examples of what it called knowledge-intensive agriculture, farming systems that derived competitive advantage not from scale or capital but from place-specific knowledge accumulated over long periods. The brief noted that the USDA's existing support structures, crop insurance formulas, conservation program designs, extension service priorities were almost entirely calibrated for large-scale commodity production and provided little support for the kind of patient, observational, relationship-based farming that the Cutler data represented. It recommended changes in policy. Whether those changes would come was uncertain. Whether the direction of the argument was correct was not. Karen Cutler, who had spent the year after the auction being quietly terrified and privately furious and outwardly steady in the way that farming spouses often are because someone has to be, planted a kitchen garden on the new farm in the spring of 2020. It was not a practical decision, the garden didn't contribute meaningfully to their income. It was something else. She grew tomatoes and pole beans and sweet corn and zucchini in the particular variety of butternut squash that her mother-in-law had grown on the same ground 40 years earlier, from seeds she had kept and passed along. The garden was her way of saying that the land and the family were still connected. That the thing the auction had tried to sever had not, in fact, been severed. Ryan Cutler, who had taken his father's side in the family arguments less often than he should have and who lived with that knowledge, came back to work on the farm in 2021. He brought his Iowa State education with him and applied it in service of what his father was doing rather than in opposition to it. He built the financial models, handled the PrairieSource reporting requirements, and began exploring additional revenue streams: a small on-farm grain processing operation, a direct relationship with a regional miller, a modest agritourism component that brought agricultural students and food company representatives to walk the fields and understand what regenerative practice looked like in practice. By 2023, those supplementary streams were adding roughly $35,000 per year to the farm's income. They would grow. Tom Beecham, who had signed the processor contract in 2012 and told Dale he was making a mistake, lost his farm in 2019. The contract had ended, prices had not recovered to the levels that made his debt serviceable, and he was 67 years old and tired. He sold voluntarily, which was better than an auction, but the result was the same. He moved to his daughter's house in Omaha. He and Dale remained friends, or became friends again. The disagreement between them had created distance that only resolved when the distance no longer served any purpose. Tom said once, talking to Dale on the phone after Dale's conference speech had been written up in the Des Moines Register, that he didn't blame Dale for being right. He said it plainly, the way Midwestern men say difficult things, briefly, directly, and without drama. Dale said he didn't think of it as being right. He said he just thought he'd paid attention to what was in front of him. That is the most accurate description of what happened. There was no invention here. No miracle technology. No charismatic disruption of an industry. There was a man who paid attention to a specific piece of ground for a very long time, who wrote down what he observed, who refused to be persuaded that the knowledge he had accumulated was worthless because the people selling the alternatives were very certain and very loud. There was a system, the commodity grain system, the contract farming system, the agricultural finance system, that was optimized for a particular kind of farm and a particular kind of farmer, and that quietly destroyed everything else. And there was a market shift, gradual and then suddenly faster, that created a price signal for what Dale had always known how to do. The 66 notebooks sit in a filing cabinet in a room off the kitchen of the new farmhouse. Harold's notebooks are older, their covers worn to a faded olive color, the handwriting in pencil that has held its impression even if not its darkness. Dale's notebooks are in the same style, composition covers, black and white, filled in ballpoint. They are not beautiful objects. They are not meant to be. They are the record of a sustained act of attention, one family's long conversation with one piece of ground, conducted over 6.5 decades, in a language made of numbers and observations and the kind of knowledge that does not transfer easily into any format that a spreadsheet can accommodate. The last entry Harold Cutler made before his stroke, in the fall of 1989, noted that the Northfields corn had come in strong despite a dry August, that the cover crop mix he had tried that year had performed better than expected, and that the east tile line was showing signs of stress that might need attention in the spring. He was right about all three of those things. His son dealt with the tile line the following April. Dale's most recent entry, from the fall of 2023, noted the yield on each field, the input costs, the quality of the cover crop establishment, and an observation about a section of the south field where water seemed to be moving differently than it had in previous years, possibly indicating a change in the tile drainage, possibly something in the soil structure. He would watch it next season. He would write down what he found. This is what farming, at its most fundamental, has always been: not the ownership of land, not the movement of commodities, not the management of debt, but the accumulation of specific, patient knowledge about a specific place. The system that nearly destroyed Dale Cutler was not evil. It was simply optimized for things other than that kind of knowledge. It priced yield per acre and debt service ratios. It did not know how to price 66 years of observation. It did not know that the thing it had discarded was the thing that mattered most. The lesson, if there is one that can be extracted cleanly from this story, is not that the small farmer always wins, or that industrial agriculture always loses, or that patience is always rewarded. None of those things are universally true. The lesson is narrower and more specific and, in that specificity, more durable, that knowledge accumulated through sustained, direct, first-person attention to a particular problem has a kind of value that is not always legible to the systems that are supposed to measure value. That what looks like stubbornness from the outside can be, from the inside, simply the refusal to pretend you know less than you do. That the people who tell you with confidence that you are wrong are not always wrong themselves, but they are not always right, and the confidence with which they speak is not, by itself, evidence of anything except confidence. Dale Cutler lost his farm on April 25, 2017. He was farming again by the fall of 2019. He was profitable by 2021. He was, by 2023, the subject of academic papers, policy briefs, and a feature in a regional agricultural magazine that described him, in terms he found mildly embarrassing, as a pioneer. He is not a pioneer. He is a man who paid attention. His father paid attention before him. The ground held what they gave it. When the conditions were right, it gave something back. That is how it has always worked, in farming and in most things that matter, the patient accumulation of attention, over long stretches of time, towards something that cannot be rushed and cannot be purchased and cannot be taken away even when everything else is. The notebooks are still being filled. The farm is still being observed. The story is still going.